You have this big installation, Livermore Laboratories, the big government laboratory.
Right.
Big shot government laboratory. And out of the whole fusion era came this holy grail of producing electricity by hydrogen fusion, which didn't throw out all this garbage and crap like fission does. It's more of an implosive, self-contained type of thing. All the billions and billions and billions of giant magnets and lasers, 220,000 volt power lines on towers, 150 feet high, insulators 20 feet long, big giant flows of money, gas, electricity, and glom pouring into this place, all for one simple engineering premise. They wanted to make a fireball stand in space. Okay? Well, nobody seems to be able to do it. Well, when I was living in the bushes in Bolinas, there was a deranged guy that lived in a house next to the bush. Okay? His name was Philo Taylor Farnsworth III. So I began to get drunk and stoned with this deranged man, okay, and was told that he's really off his rocker, okay, and nobody wanted to even bring me near him, and I didn't know, and I looked at his facial features, and I go, well, he's got to be a Farnsworth. So at any rate, we get drunk together, and the first thing, the drunken mentality, along with all, the foul language and puffing up like frigate birds. My transmitter put out more power than yours. And the whole thing, it results in that I tell him one of my best stories, which happened to do something that created the beginnings of a fusion reaction. What we used to do when I was a kid is the science club was kind of also the pyromania club in those days. Janet Reno wasn't invented yet, okay? So weird things would happen. So in the course of experimenting I could get all the old tubes from RCA. I had moved a 10 kilowatt transmitter from RCA into my parents' garage. Okay, this thing was the terror of the neighborhood. Well, I found out this terror spread a little farther than that. So what we did is we get these big tubes, back in these giant globes, and of course the ones that were good, were very carefully taken care of. But the ones that were no good, if you still could get current through them, okay, as my parents once a week would go out to a movie or something like that. So a whole science club would show up to my laboratory, okay, and we would play Nuclear Meltdown. And this is what playing Nuclear Meltdown was. We'd take the tube, okay, we'd hook it to the big 3,300 volt switchboard. This thing's got about enough juice to run a whole neighborhood. It's clamped right where the wires come in off the meter, on our side of the meter, but nevertheless it had to be clamped right on. It just draws so much power the whole neighborhood would just go into a brownout every time the telegraph key was hit. So it was a 3 or 4 person operation. One man controlled the plate, one man controlled the screen, one man controlled the control grid, and somebody kind of had to deal with me with the whole, to get this thing hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. Okay, and the thing, all of a sudden would go at some point and would take off, and all the meters, the big Frankenstein switchboard, all the meters would go backwards, okay? And the bravest guy had to have his hands on the abort switch to interrupt this sudden explosion of electricity that would be created in this process. Just briefly, there'd be this sudden explosion of electricity. Well, it turns out to be fusion reactions of this type are very heavy microwave emitters. And I learned when I got in the Navy, every time we did this, it jammed out all the radars in Hamilton Air Force Base. So when I told that to Philo, he was just completely bent out of shape. He couldn't have a better story than that, but he had to. So he disappeared into his bedroom. It was a typical madman, house of boxes, books all dusty, piled to the floor, the ceiling. You couldn't turn the TV off because of the weak cathode, so you put a piece of cardboard in front of it. The inventor of TV's son couldn't fix his own TV. It was a madhouse place, Lots of bottles of wine going down in his guts all the time. Drugs I've never even heard of before. But at any rate, that's where the action. When you live on the street, you're more tolerant. So he goes into his room and he pulls out this screwed up cardboard box, about this big, and he dumps it on the table, and he goes, well, you're so smart. Tell me what these are. And I go, what do you got here? He goes, these are my father's tubes. Okay, well, I knew about the TV, but these weren't TV tubes. Okay, so I pick up the tubes. I've been playing with tubes since I was 6 years old. My grandmother used to build them in RCA. It's just in my genes. I look at these tubes, and these things are crazy. Anybody would say this is insanity. Okay, big giant grids, but no cathodes, and like electrodes sticking out of the side, and all this stuff. And but the thing is, I know how to make tubes. So I'm looking at them, and I start to see what's going on here. And he's sitting there. Remember that cartoon character of that dog that would laugh with that kind of horse after the dog screwed somebody that screwed him? I forget the character. That's exactly how Philo laughed. It was that kind of... You couldn't really hear it. It was kind of like a growling inside. He was content. So I pulled this one tube out, which was just an empty quart of glass, and it had an umbilical cord, so to speak, that came off of it to pump all the air out during operation. It was a laboratory tube. They broke it off the pump and discarded it after the experiment. It said two little metal shells pointing at each other, kind of like two little mirrors, coated with some kind of crappy-looking stuff, silver cesium oxide compound, and a simple ring in the middle. Well, it's a simple, electrostatic focus tube with an anode in the middle, and the two plates, and little tiny wires came in because the voltage was so high. I guess it had to be oil or something around. It looked like it operated about 100,000 volts, which is a lot for a small tube. But I looked at the glass. The glass had been all attacked by something. So it used to be in the old color TVs, there was a certain tube that shorted out the high voltage so that it couldn't get out of control. It's called a shunt regulator, 6BK4. And they glow every color in the rainbow and make the TV repairmen sick. And what it does is it turns the glass, the radiation turns the glass on the tube chocolate brown. And that's how you can tell how long the tube's been in the set. So I'm looking at this glass, and it's like all baked by some kind of incredible electrical activity that couldn't have come through those little tiny wires. So I go, Philo, something took off in this tube, didn't it? And then he stopped laughing and got all crappy with me again. I go, Philo, tell me what happened in the tube. And so he told me I could see what happened. What happened is and this is about 1932, is Farnsworth was working with a radically new vacuum tube technology that did not use any of these glowing cathodes or any of these emitters. The patent situation back then was such that RCA owned radio. You couldn't build anything. That's what started in Bolinas with the Alexanderson system. Lit this thing up, a star appeared in the middle, turn off the power, and it stayed there for a brief period of time. So that changed my life forever. So here you have this giant laboratory and all these billions and billions and billions of kilowatt-hour dollars being expended and all the grooviness and frigate bird activity that goes along with it. And here's some guy in a laboratory on Green Street in San Francisco, okay, on a poverty existence because he's never got anything out of television, does the same thing in an empty bottle, for so to speak.
Where are the two now?
The Farnsworth family still has them, but it doesn't stop there. So what happened is my first laboratory got destroyed in San Francisco, and that's when I lost most of the RCA equipment. That's all based on the campaign slogan, Diane will make a difference. So that's when San Francisco basically swirled into the outgoing tide. So my 8 cents a square foot went to $1 a square foot. So now how are you going to move tons of switchboards 15 feet high, transformers that weigh 4,000 or 5,000 pounds? Commonweal had already smashed the rest of it at RCA. The Park Service got my warehouse at Fort Mason Pier 3. So everything went to the dump. And it was time to eat out of garbage cans again for another couple of years. So what I did is I made friends with a high school kid up there in Bolinas who was a prodigal genius type thing that Philo had trained at an early age. The kid was a genius beyond belief in a lot of different areas. He started hanging out with me. So we built a laboratory in this bedroom. So what I did is I took some of the remaining pieces from RCA and configured them. I decided, well, there's nothing else to do with this stuff other than make a Tesla coil. But make it the way Tesla decided to make it. At any rate, to make a long story short, we worked with this, we experimented, went out to RCA, got more transmitter parts, because I could always go back out and get more, because the company was still, station was still operating then. We build this thing. I take old burned out street lights. We're using the experiment. We get dumpster loads of them from Lease Light in San Francisco. The street lights off of Van Ness Street. They pull them out every certain amount of months. And there's a whole dumpster full of them somewhere. There used to be. We put the street light in these monopolar fields that I just described from these coils. And the street light that we used for this experiment was the one we'd used previously for all of our spark gap experiments and everything. And something had started to transform with the bulb. We put this thing in the field within a matter of a minute or two of working the thing in the field. You have to be careful because they explode violently. Full galaxy appears inside the bulb, just like a picture of one of these Nova TV deals. You can spins, whole thing, the stars, the nebulas, the suns, all the colors of the rainbow is spinning inside a burned out street light and virtually powering and containing itself, which has gone beyond the Farnsworth. Now we have a whole astronomical creation floating around in a light bulb on a workbench, and then it explodes the bulb. But after it explodes the bulb, for like a tenth of a second, it's not long, it sits there without any bulb to contain it.
What is it? What's in it?
That's the creative force. This electrical monopolar field is how creation comes about. There is no evolution or any of that type of stuff. It's the electrical field at the time creates what exists, and it's always changing this way and that way. All living organisms are all based, just like all machines, are all based on the same mathematical function. All trees, plants, flowers, humans, everything's based on what's called the golden ratio. It's a definite geometric pattern, and all of these electrical discharges associated with these Tesla transformers are all golden ratio proportioned and tend to be self-organizing and self-powering. So that ends the story. $1 trillion in the Livermore laboratories, and a deranged high school kid and a homeless person go beyond it in the laboratory. And that's how I was endeared to the Farnsworth family. Because Philo's mother, which was the wife of the inventor, came to the laboratory to see this, and when she saw, that here this is going on with junk and no money, and her husband had devoted half of his life to researching this, then it was time to start being friends and talking. So I had their whole Farnsworth notebooks and everything available to me, all of it.
He's referring to Pem Farnsworth, who spoke to us in 2002 at the Tesla Society by phone on the anniversary of the 75th anniversary of television, invention of television here in San Francisco. It's the same person, Pem Farnsworth.
Yeah, your question.
The neutron, does it have mass?
I don't even know if it exists.
Very well, thank
It doesn't enter into the electrical equation.
you. The star, you can reproduce the effect that you described, the astronomical emergence. This is reproducible for you?
It won't happen continuously. You can't have one stand. It's something that only can exist with pulses or transient waveforms. As you get a burst, you have one of these patterns stand, and your mind, of course, you can remember the geometric position in space. The next one, which occurs several fractions of a second later, is in another position. And then you notice that the next one occurs in another. After you watch this, you find that every other discharge is rotating in one particular direction. And every discharge in between is rotating in the opposite direction. So you produce a rather interesting space waveform where you have two spirals going in opposite directions, depending upon whether it's odd or even cycle in time. In other words, 1, 3, 5, 7, so on. Starting from the first count, the first pulse will be rotating in one direction, and vice versa, 2, 4, 6, 8 will be rotating in the opposite direction. Okay, to carry this one step further, what we've done is superimposed fluxes from Tesla transformers in bulbs filled with gaseous media. Okay. And when you do this, you find that you actually start to get galactic formations and what appears to be outlines of marine organisms, all with the most stunning color. And this connects directly to Reich's cosmic superimposition theory, where if you take two primary energy fluxes and converge them in a space, these longitudinal, not scalar, but longitudinal fluxes will start to form a spiral formation, which grabs up the energy in these spirals are all, again, based on log periodic form. A couple of times I had the good fortune to actually see what looks like photographs of deep space appear in these bulbs. You actually got to get your galaxies and nebula, and it's something you have to kind of pinch yourself to see if you're awake or if it's really happening. And I found some kind of ether pressure usually appears inside the bulb, and the bulb explodes, such as what characterizes like 100 pounds per square inch. So not only is it producing form, but even matter itself appears to be synthesized out of this process.
I will go back to the board and do a little brief description of what multi-packer action is all about. This was something discovered by Philo Farnsworth around 1930. He developed a whole series of tubes based on this principle that eventually led to practical nuclear fusion. Totally electronic, required no large magnets or lasers, and the thing basically occupied a space of roughly 10 cubic feet and produced 100 kilowatts of direct current, 1 ampere, 100 kV, for about 5 minutes before the little electrode screens inside the tube would melt. Going back to the original photo multipactor, what happens is something will dislodge an electron from the plate, which will fly off and then be attracted to the other plate. The little high-frequency oscillations of the wiring will produce jittering. And this electron flies off, hits the other plate, will knock more electrons off, which will fly around and go back to the other plate and knock more electrons off until eventually you can build very powerful UHF oscillations with these things. The reason Farnsworth developed this tube was at the time the tetrode vacuum tube had not been developed yet. And being Farnsworth was in the process of inventing television at that time, he needed very high gain, high impulse response, or you might say wide band amplifiers, and he just couldn't get that out of the old triodes. So he decided to abandon the hot cathode grid tube completely and came up with this photo multipactor tube, which now in its final form that's available to us today is known as the photo multiplier, which many people are familiar with and forms the heart of every television camera. Television camera tube, of course, being invented by Philo Farnsworth, as many know. Our dielectric induction detector was basically this down here, using this multipactive process to provide roughly a gain of about 60 to 70 decibels, so that the slight amount of ionization produced by the induction produced a significant response on the meter. Now, of course, we hook this to a tank circuit tuned to the appropriate transit time frequency. This effect will be magnified even more, and gains of 120 decibels are possible with a single tube.
Okay, so with that, with the cosmos coming into cosmic induction, can you explain that?
Well, I coined the term cosmic induction generator from this configuration of Tesla transformers that I built that caused a galaxy to appear in a burned out streetlight placed between the two fields of the coil. So there's this concept that's floating around called the electric universe. You've probably heard about that. They're a pretty well-established group, and their beliefs are very similar to mine, and they believe that everything has an electrical origin, and that it's all these, I don't know how they would look at it, but all these lines of force in space are what, form the galaxies and the stars and planets and cause things to be alive, and everything comes out of this electrical flux which fills all space, which can build up absolutely unbelievable quantities of magnitude, because the tensions are so high between distant planets and the area is so large which the field covers that we're talking about forces that we couldn't even begin to comprehend.
Yeah, and I subscribe to the electrical principle of the galaxy and the Earth itself, just as you were talking about.
So when I saw this galaxy appear in the light bulb, well, then it made sense to me that it's a cosmic induction.
Okay, could you define what you're talking about when you say galaxy, though? So
well, it was a plasma got started in the bulb, and it took the form of an actual galaxy. There were little stars and suns and the spiral nebula with the body in the middle, and was very dynamic.
Okay, so you had energized a vacuum tube, or
well, what it is I had 2 Tesla transformers that were out of phase, and they were pointed at each other, so it was kind of like a field generator. So there was this intense electrostatic field between these two transformers. So a really severe displacement current was flowing back and forth at about 3 million cycles a second. So then the thing was, is we get these street lights from the, back when they had the series street lighting systems, is when they burn out, sometimes because the voltage keeps going up, is they vaporize the inside of the bulb. In other words, the filament and everything gets vaporized, and those are the kind of bulbs we'd look for. And then, because there's no metal in there to interfere with the flux, then we put that in there, and that metal vapor inside the bulb, along with the argon that the bulbs are filled with, which was kind of like the primordial medium, this would always polarize into some kind of organic or cosmic shape. And in the beginning, we did get what, if you looked at it, you would say that's a galaxy. And the bulb exploded under violent pressure, even though it had a partial vacuum inside, because the force of creation was trying to literally escape from the bulb. And sometimes this thing would just, these entities would just float there in between the two transformers without any bulb at all. It maintained its own vacuous boundary.
Now,
I thought that was going to make me the world's most famous person. Is plasma containment on such a simple level, and I just got the door slammed right in my face, and that was the end of that, and everything went to the dump.
Now, there was one of the first engineers of TV, one of the tubes that he was working with, you had a chance to go through his equipment.
Oh, Farnsworth.
Farnsworth.
Yeah, I actually held the tubes in my hands and was able to experiment. At that point, nobody had known about these. I was the first one outside of the family and the people that worked with Farnsworth that had ever seen or known about these things. And this was happening at the same time that we were doing the light bulbs. So that's what got the Farnsworth family interested, is, here in a high school kid's bedroom. And, this kid and myself had modified his bedroom into a laboratory, and RCA supplied all the transformers and coils and everything that we needed. And by some coincidence, that's when I ran across Philo Farnsworth III, the son of the inventor, and his mother, the wife of the inventor. And I invited them to see what we were doing, and they were just completely blown away that with just this simple, crude apparatus, just junk, radio junk, we were doing stuff that normally you'd think you'd need a giant laboratory for.
Right.
So I was adopted by the family immediately.
Yeah.
And given access to all the tubes and knowledge and everything that was available. It's really tragic that Farnsworth didn't write books. It's one of the biggest losses to science that you could ever conceive of. The understanding this person had of the electron and how to, because it was a capitalistic situation, just like with Tesla, they clam up and they don't write.
Yeah.
Lost all of it.
So you were looking at one of his tubes and you saw something very similar to what you had experienced?
Yeah, it was a creational event
Uh-huh.
at a so-called singularity point inside of a field geometry. And I think I've recounted that story a lot about, we were getting drunk together and telling sea stories and whatever. And I told him one of my favorites, and so at any rate, he had to come back. He had the counter on that one. He didn't know what to do, so he decided to drag the secret tube box out from underneath his bed. This was the madman's house, with junk everywhere and what have you, and showed me this tube and snickered. He goes, "You're so smart, you figure this out." And I did. And he made a star inside the tube.
Yeah.
And it was self-sustaining. So I knew I was on the right track.
So with what they do with plasma, is there a relation to it, or is that something completely different?
It's not related to anything that either Farnsworth or myself were working on.
Okay. But you had mentioned Tesla. What would you like to say about Tesla?
Well, Tesla was doing similar things. Tesla's vacuum tube research was producing stunning effects, and that's why I have this international fame, is because, like with this galaxy thing and what have you, I'm the only person that's ever duplicated that.
Mm-hmm.
No one's ever been able to duplicate this pressure in the bulb that pushes out, and and then the formation into some kind of boundary condition that's self-sustaining. And Tesla was the only one that ever did that. that people, heard about, and I did it. I duplicated it.
Now, was this also
called the cosmic induction generator? And for people listening, I want to read a bit from the explanation written by, I believe, your protege, John Pawlowski?
Yeah, Polakowski.
Polakowski,
Yeah, right.
John Polakowski, where he says, one of the most awe-inspiring experiments by Eric Dollard was called the cosmic induction generator, or the SIG. So named because the SIG produces intense lines of derelict induction that cause a plasma to form, which takes on the shape and form of a galaxy in space. The aspect that is extraordinary is that the plasma doesn't take on random shapes or motions. It forms a mini-universe. Witnesses to the original experiment describe the plasma as being alive, conscious, and having a memory. This display of the galaxy was termed the galaxy in a bulb because the plasma formed in a burned-out incandescent bulb. This really sounds amazing, and the images are super impressive. I mean, what's happening here? Are you having galaxies emerge inside a light bulb?
Exactly. This is your whole electric universe. What was really ironic at the time I was doing this in my RCA lab out in Bolinas, I was concurrently reading Wilhelm Reich's Cosmic Superimposition, where he's showing how two ether streams, would converge into each other and start this spiral form. And that's how the hurricanes and the galaxies and all these things take shape. That's what makes the Earth rotate. It's what keeps the planets in their spot. There's nothing to do with gravity. We're living in this swirling vortex that carries the planets with it and what have you. And basically, I was using the dielectric lines of force, or the Faraday tubes that came out of the Tesla transformers, to produce this kind of dual flux flow that converged into the spirals, and that's how I got the galaxy. I only got a complete galaxy once in the beginning, and it was very difficult to get anything of that beauty and form to appear later because there's so many factors involved. And it does seem to sense what is people are thinking or what have you around it too. So it kind of acts like it's alive. It reminds me of an old Outer Limits episode where they had, some big field generator, and a kind of a chamber, and they started to produce a universe in it. And they were fascinated, that they could see the formations of stars and galaxies. And then what happened that freaked everybody out is some kind of God or consciousness emerged and came out of the thing and started harassing them and freaked them all out, that not only had they created what appeared to be a physical universe, but there were lives and deaths and creations and destructions. And it was a real universe with a real spiritual entity that basically attended it.
God, this is the most fascinating thing. Of all the work Aaron sent me, it really was this that blew my mind the most. And that's all important context for this last image where John goes on to show, all these pictures that look like these galaxies or this type of plasma discharges that the electric universe folks talk about, just like you mentioned. And then he hit me with this last image, and it says, this one is very mysterious. First, notice the organic plasma formation in the bulb, but also notice the quote-unquote figure that appears towards the bottom of the picture. Is it an image artifact, or is it an entity that decided to appear when living electricity is present? And it does look like a little ghost or figure of light. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know.
Is that this thing?
I don't know. I mean, it could have been anything, but it looks weird. That's one thing what's fascinating is even after the bulb explodes because of the ether pressure, there's a partial vacuum in it. The bulb's supposed to implode, but it doesn't. It explodes. This formation will maintain its boundary condition and stand there in space with no bulb between the coils for about 1 second until finally it can't maintain its boundary condition. What? And we've never had anybody get injured in these experiments until there was a point which I periodically go through on a cyclic basis where everything's going to get destroyed or it's trying to be stolen from me or whatever. So So the women in white got me out of the Integratron. They tried to steal my lab at gunpoint, but we had guns too. There was some guy that was a research engineer, developmental engineer, independent, making stuff for the car companies or what have you, some kind of engine or something he was working on. And he was going to be our patron, and he was going to pay to get the stuff safely moved to Santa Barbara. Well, actually, he had kind of more malevolent intent. It seemed like he wanted to basically, get the stuff and then push us out. So he came by the lab one day to see this bulb phenomenon. And what was inside the bulb didn't like him. And the bulb exploded and threw all the glass at him. And this thing was like floating in space, and we never saw him again.
What the hell? Man. Well, it's like, if you do venture into some of the paranormal fields, when it comes to spirits or non-human intelligence, there seems to be an electrical or plasma-based relationship of some kind. Some say you draw their attention when you start doing things in this realm, and they might even show up. Some say Tesla interacted with these beings. Do you think there's any truth to that idea of non-human intelligences that are somehow connected to these realms of electricity and plasma? It seems like you might.
Well, that's conceivable, but, you have to remember, I'm an engineer. I'm not a theologian or, what have you. But the thing is, I do have this voodoo, and I don't play with it. I don't want to talk to spirits. It's best to stay away from them and let the voodoo do its own thing. If you try to get in some kind of communications with these so-called disembodied spirits or entities or whatever, I've had friends, I've warned them to, not play with this stuff. And if they do, they end up dead.
Jeez, that's a heavy consequence.
So it's best to stay away from that.